So today in class we covered the second week's lesson, and on the Canvas site you'll find a zip file, and inside that zip file there are some materials that we'll use today in the tutorial, two models, and some tools. This INI file here is a display setting for Rhino 3D, and it may register as an issue sometimes when you try to download it. It says warning. It is clean, but sometimes a .ini makes it seem like it might be a virus. But I'll show you how to set that up if you choose to just do it on your own. So let's take a look at the models. The first one is just the test drawing, and I'll open that up in this Rhino file here. And what you'll see is in top, I'm starting to think about how I might make an analytique drawing of the Barcelona pavilion. Now, for me, this kind of detail of the cruciform column is the most important aspect. And so I'm using that as an anchor point to start to set up different lines and trajectories that then ultimately holds other drawings, elevations, a fake axonometric drawing, which is just 2D with some lines projected down from it. This interior view here, although it appears to be 3D, is what I'm calling faux 3D. It's just 2D elements arranged around in three-dimensional space. There's really no extrusion, there's no detailed 3D modeling other than the cruciform column. Obviously here we're just completely flat as a make 2D. The other file you here I have is open up. This is the analytique file, which is much larger. And here in this view, you can see I've named it AA. If I right click the view, go to set view and named views, you can change any of these names, or remember that we're going to always come back to this perspective. That's usually helpful because if I accidentally move something, I can right click, set view, and go to perspective. With nothing selected, under properties, we're able to control what type of projection we get. This is 2-point perspective, which makes it a little bit easier to match things up after the fact. If we looked simply in parallel, and I'll enlarge this view, what you'll see is there's not a whole lot to this. I have two vertical planes that represent two of the walls. I have a plane in the background just to kind of stop our view. I've got a plane for the floor and a plane for the ceiling. And I modeled these all based off the floor plan. The only thing that has any detail really is the cruciform column. And here I have an interior elevation of kind of the glass line work. I'm going to use the gumball to move that line work out 50 feet. And for us to make image materials and set up kind of channels and layers, I know that I need actual solid geometry. So I'm going to make a vertical plane here and make that the exact same size. In class, we looked at everything that we see here in the scene is on the faux 3D layer. And to do material IDs, we need to create sublayers with different colors. So let's do that. This is the glass work. Then I'll create one for the floor. Green, stone, red, stone, columns, ceiling. Let's do book match. We can see if we can get that mapped in from beyond. And that should be it. For all of these, I want to set unique colors because I'm going to be using them as clipping masks. So I'll set up the glass is aquamarine, the floor can be gold, the green stone, surprise, surprise, will be green, red stone will make red. The columns, we can make any color we'd like, but maybe I'll use this magenta e-color. The ceiling, I'm going to set as gray, and the book match stone, we will set as chartreuse. So now if I look at this view in shaded, by middle clicking, I can pull up my pop-up menu. In shaded, nothing changed, and that's because none of these things exist on those layers just yet. So let me take the book matched, and I'll right click, and I'll change its object. The floor here will go to floor. The ceiling here will go to ceiling. This is the green stone. This is the red stone. All of this stuff back here was the glass. And we'll grab our cruciform columns, just two of them, and those are going to go on columns. Now I'll put this right back by clicking and saying I want to move it negative 50 feet so it's in the correct view. If I right click, set view, and go to perspective, what we'll see are all of those elements are set up on different colors. You'll also see right here I have what's called the safe frame. That's under rendering. I'm showing the safe frame. I can turn that off. With this geometry, This is all just planar geometry. I can grab that stuff and this thing here, and the column there. I'm going to use Make 2D. And by using Make 2D, I can create a line drawing. And as I do that, I want to maintain source layers. Because these are all on independent layers, it'll create independent layers for the line work. And that's really helpful as we move into Illustrator. I don't need scene silhouettes. I don't need clipping plane intersections. I do need the viewport rectangle, and I do want it grouped. I'm not going to use any hidden lines in this drawing, although maybe we could. So I'll say OK. What you'll see is it creates a faux 3D layer. That's my drawing. And then under that, we have visible curves and clipping plane interactions. Well, I told it not to do that, but it did anyway. If I jump to my top view, you'll see that that drawing is registered right up on 0, 0, 0, which is good. And if I deselect the drawing, you'll see each of those colors copied the layer color that we set up under our faux 3D layers. That's really helpful. So I can grab all of this stuff and zoom selected, and I can export it. And I'm going to export it over to Illustrator. When I go to save it, I'm just going to use a snapshot of the view. Because this is a perspectival interior view, it really doesn't set a scale. If I was working with something that was a known scale, an elevation, a detail, a plan, I could preserve the model scale, and that might help me moving forward. Because I have the exterior rectangle here, I don't need a viewport rectangle, and I have no hatches, so really I'm fine with just the way it is. So now it's exported. I've now opened my file up in Adobe Illustrator, and what you can see is each layer that came from Rhino is coded and colored exactly as it was before. I can zoom in here, select all by using Control A, and I'm going to click the stroke and set it to black. Although I want the layers colored, my line work should just be black and white. I'm also going to set my stroke weight to be a 1/4 point, just to start out. As I zoom in here, I can edit some of this. Let's say this line closest to us will be 1 point, and the edges of the red wall here will be maybe 0.75. We can start to build in some depth. The glass back here has a lot of line work, and so even though these are very thin, they show up very thick. There's just too many pieces of them. So I'm going to set this back down to 0.1, that's even finer, and we'll let that outside edge really be the thing that indicates the edge of the glass. You can see there when we zoom in, all those layers and lines that made up that glass. So let's zoom out. Right now, we see, it looks like this one here. Let's check our layers. This is the viewport rectangle. And here we have the clipping plane interactions, which are slightly off. So I'm going to go find the clipping plane intersections, which I don't want, and I'm going to turn them off. Turn on my viewport rectangle. We can lock everything here. And anytime I see the word clipping plane, here, 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 and here, I'm actually going to delete those layers. I don't need them. All right, so taking this, we want to start to kind of use collage techniques and make the space come a little bit more to life, a way to explain the interior. We looked today in class on how we can come back to this view and use the color of that geometry as clipping planes in Photoshop, clipping masks. To do that, I'm going to be using the flat color shader. And what you see there is there's no line work. Everything is just the geometry, and it's colored flatly the color of the layer. To set that up, I have to go to right click, display options. I can go to my display modes. I was able to import that file that's in the zip file, the INI color for flat color. And when I come down and look at the display modes, I can look at the flat color display mode. The real trick of this is that under lighting scheme, if I'm here at the top level of that, it's set to no lighting and the ambient color is set to black. All of these things are then set up so that all the colors match, but really this is doing the bulk of the work. Let's look at this compared to shaded. Shaded, we see iso curves, we see edges, and that's not what's going to be helpful as we move forward. So let's go to flat color. I asked how we could export this without rendering it, and the trick to do that is to use view or view capture to file. So with the command view capture to file, I'm going to set the scale to 2, and I'm going to browse for the directory on my desktop right now. There's this file, there's my example folder, and this is going to be our material ID that will export that out. Then in Illustrator, I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to set that layer to the very bottom. I'm going to go File, Place, and I'll use that material ID and match up these corners from top left to bottom right. Let's see, I'm a little bit off. It looks like there's just a little bit of discrepancy between my line weight, but that's okay. I can come in and just make small adjustments to make sure this thing fits perfectly. And oops, let's see, if I just hold Shift, I can actually change the perspective. Just a little bit off. Drag this side in. And panning down, I want to make sure that the bottom's matched up too, so. Slightly off. There we go. Much closer there. So after a little bit of fussing, it looks like my viewport rectangle somehow was just slightly off. I enlarged it, reduced it, kind of shifted around, and here I finally have it lined up. I'm then going to make a save as of this Illustrator file. We'll say this is interior to Photoshop. Now I'll need to open up Photoshop and open up this file. When I open the Photoshop file, well, when I open the Illustrator file in Photoshop, it gives me some import dialog, and basically these default settings will be fine for me. So I'll say OK, and you'll see everything comes in on just one layer. There's a little bit of space on the outside, but we can work with that. Now, I'm going to use these colors to separate and use as clipping masks. And I'm going to layer in all of the textures that I provided in my material folder. So let's look under materials, and we'll start with the green wall here. So drag and drop that in. I'm going to use this edge here to try to enlarge this. I'll have to zoom out a little bit. Something like that. And then when I have the active transform on that, and I can use Control T if I need to, I can right click on my object and use the perspective warp. So by perspective, I can actually move this up and down and help it match the perspective of my drawing. Let's do that again with the red wall. So here, I just drag and drop the red wall. And then I'm going to want to try to scale this down and match it to the far right-hand side of the red wall. Sometimes it can be a little hard to see. So if I drop the opacity on my image, it makes it a little bit easier to tell where it's meant to be. So let's grab it there, and we'll bring this one down. And we'll just have to work to get this edge to match up perfectly with our lines. It's pretty close right there. I'll again right click, go into perspective edit, and I'll drag the other side up so that we get the perspective of the red wall. It's going to be somewhere around there. Might shift it up a little bit. Might bring that over. That's pretty close. And although it's not perfectly matched, it'll work for us. So I'll set the opacity back to 100%. But now we can see that our red wall jumps in front of our green wall. I'll turn off the red wall. I'm going to use Select, Color Range, and click the red. In Photoshop, it will select all of that red and say OK. Then I can come back up to my image, and I'll use the Layer Mask tool here to mask out just that one portion. I'll do this again with the travertine. Drag in the travertine. We'll set it kind of so it runs all the way to the back. We can use the Distort tool to see if we can get it to run along that perspective, then zoom out and drag this other corner so that we get some flat feel to the floor, something like that. Same as before, I'll turn off these layers, go to Select, Color Range. This time it'll be the yellow color of the floor. Go back to my travertine and mask it out. We'll go one more time for the book match stone, which is in the back. You can see this stone here. I'll make it pretty large. This might be helpful to drop its opacity down. Then we can see that it should live somewhere around there. Drag this one up so that it's somewhere around there. And then again, I can use the perspective tool to try to bend this into perspective, like so. Set it back to 100%, jump down to this layer, and even without turning things off, I can say Select, Color Range, and select behind it. You can see right now it selects everything that's in the image. So here, I've got to turn those layers off. select color range, just that chartreuse color, and I'll mask this portion out here. So just that quickly, we start to get kind of a photo collage of everything here. If I wanted to keep going, I could look to do a selection layer on the black sky. I have some of the dots in the green picked up, so I'll just use my marquee and Alt to deselect them, leaving me just that. Here I could come in and I could do some like sky color, maybe it's somewhere around there. I could just actually paint that in. And if I wanted to do it one more time, I'll turn these layers off and I will grab, select color range, this, oops, I'm on the wrong layer, there we go. Deselect everything, select color range, select color range, and it's going to be this aquamarine color. Create a new layer, turn that one off. And back there, maybe I'll use a gradient. And I'll use a gradient fade from white to blue. And I'll just draw a gradient like that. I want to be a little bit bluer, not aquamarine. There we go. And I can even drop that opacity a little bit, so it will give us an inflection on the glass. So with this layer, with my layer 1 turned off, I'm going to do a save as and save this as interior to Photoshop. We'll say OK. And back in Illustrator, I'll make a new layer. This one, it's above the stack. And I'll say File, Place, and I'll use the Photoshop new, this Illustrator file, the Photoshop file, sorry. Drag this one down. It should match up somewhere around there. And I'll have to do a little bit of repositioning. All right, so after a little bit of nudging it left and right and stretching its scale just slightly, you can see that we get a depiction of the interior. The other tool we looked at is to use the Rhino Render. So I'm going to go to Render and set up the current render properties. I'm going to set this to make sure that it matches my viewport, and I'm going to give it a decent DPI, say 350. I'll say OK, and then when I click Render, Rhino will provide me a Rhino Render. Now I haven't done anything with materiality, and there's not a lot of 3D geometry, and there's no sun setup. But that doesn't really matter, because what I'm looking to do is to use the distance channel. So as here in the distance channel, I have this image, and I can simply just click to copy this image to clipboard. Then in Illustrator, I'll make a new layer, and I'll paste that. It comes in much, much bigger, so I want to come and drop this down in size, holding Shift. I can move this up and try to match up its corners. And holding Shift down to make sure that we get this aligned. I can zoom back in. That image, I can set its opacity by clicking the word opacity to multiply and then dropping it down just to provide a little bit of depth shading. And just like that, I've created kind of a photo collage interior without ever really rendering. There is one additional technique we looked at while we're working in the Illustrator on using brushes for stippling. And let's just say that I wanted to do a little stippling on this column. Well, thankfully I kept everything separate. So right, this is the line work for the column, so I can unlock that layer. I'm going to create a live paint of it by clicking this circle. In class we used boxes. Here I'm going to show you how we do it with live paint. So I'll use live paint. The quick command for that is K, and I'll click that. Now, right now, everything in here is just going to be a silverish tone, right? It's a cruciform column, so I can just paint everything of the cruciform column silver, something like that. Then I'm going to grab that object, and I'm going to make a copy of this. I'm going to make a copy of that layer, curves and all. To do that, let's just do it this way. I'm going to click the object and use Control-C. On a new layer above, this will be my stipple. I'm going to do one additional layer, and I'm going to go Edit, Paste in Place. What that means is that this will be my clipping mask, this will be my stipple layer, and this will actually be the geometry. I gave you in this file some tools, and in those tools included the stipple shading brushes. If I open those brushes, I can go to the brush tool by hitting B, clicking the brush palette, and picking a stipple that I like, maybe something like this. That'll work for me. If I copy this into my stipple layer, it'll bring that brush over with me. You can see here in my document, I don't have that brush. So I'll go to layers on the stipple, I'll paste that. And now if I check brushes, there's my stipple that I've used. I can delete this, I don't need it anymore. That was just a way for me to get the stipple here. I'll zoom in, and I'm going to want to stipple the cruciform column. So let's go to stipple and just drag right down the column. You know what? Let's make it smaller. I can double click the stipple here, and right now the size is based on pressure. We can say that it will be fixed, and we can say that it will be, pretty small. Spacing, we can edit all of this stuff. We'll say OK, and this time I'll drag one more time and draw with my brush up the column and see what we get. It's oh, there we go, that's why. Because I have the mask layer on, I can't actually see the stipple, and it's really farly spaced out. So I'm going to edit, undo, go to my brush one more time, edit the stipple. This was set to fix, so we'll increase it a little bit. We'll say OK. I'll apply to strokes, and you can see now it's a little bit better. So I'll do a couple more stipples here. I will turn off the mask just to see what we got. I can just come in, do a little bit like so. I really want to get this far edge a little bit darker, like that. I'm going to click the little dot on the layer of the stipple, which selects every stipple. We'll go to Objects, Compound Path, Make. Then with masks, this is a simple object already, but I could click that Object, Compound Path, Make. It says there's too many things. So what I want is for this mask to be a clipping mask to that stipple. So I go to Objects, Clipping Mask, Make. So we get an error using that live paint. Let's see what we have to do. All right, so a clipping mask by itself cannot act as, a live paint cannot act as a clipping mask. But if I double click my live paint, I can go in and select everything here and expand it. Expanding it makes them independent objects. I'm then going to take everything in the live paint, selecting all in the live paint. I've double clicked, you can see I'm in the mask group. I'm going to cut it. I'm using Control X. I'll then go Edit, Paste in Place, Object, Make a Compound Path. It was previously in a live paint object. Now I have it as separate objects. I'll make a compound path, and you can see it changes appearance because it's now one big object. Once I do that, it can serve the role as being a clipping mask, like that. Now that I've clipped my stipple, I can click on the stipple layer here, and I can adjust its opacity and dial that in exactly as I wanted it. Maybe somewhere like that. So if I zoom out, that was a quick demonstration of the techniques that we looked at. The other one we looked at quickly and briefly is how we might use gradients. So I'll just make a box up here. If I use that fill, I can click the middle button here, which is a gradient button. There it is. I can use the G command to transform this gradient. I can look on how I might set it up. On the right-hand side, there's the gradient tool. I can change its angle, say 45 degrees. I can change the colors by double-clicking, making sure that I set this to an RGB. That way I can control its actual color. And let's say I don't want this to be black. I'll say RGB. We'll make this one green. And at this end, I'm going to set its opacity down so that the whole thing fades. That's another tool that you could look at on how to fill your scene and create a much more dynamic composite image. I hope that helps.